Encore. Written by Anna Sunny. Narrated by J.B. Webb. The three friends clanked their tankards together, toasting Corallon for their good fortune. Their party had acquired decent rooms for the night at a moderately clean tavern, and they had enough food and drink to fill their bellies. What more could you ask for? The hum of the bar's other patrons buzzed in the background. Throwing back her ale, Taliana slammed her empty mug on the bar counter. Gods, this place is dull. Would it kill them to throw a painting up on the wall? She gestured towards the barkeep for another drink, her pointed ears twitching restlessly. If one finds life dull, it is one's duty to make some color, Howard intoned dryly, his crinkled eyes betraying his mirth as he nursed his drink. Say no more, my friend. A tavern without any art is sad indeed, Ishmael declared, his own drink forgotten as an idea overtook him. As the bartender refilled Taliana's drink, Ishmael leaned towards the gruff man. Sir, would you mind if we performed for your patrons? Aye, only if you aren't expecting coin for it, he replied, eyeing the strangers warily, noting the various instruments on their persons, as well as their garish garb. He didn't trust artsy types, and the elven woman was unbearably rude. But customers were more likely to stick around and buy an extra drink or two if there was some entertainment distracting them. Wonderful. There's nothing I love more than putting on a show for no pay, Howard said, eyes sparkling. The bartender interpreted this as sarcasm, but his friends knew that he was, unfortunately, very serious. Let's make this a bit more interesting, someone behind them chimed in, coming up on the group seated at the bar, leaving a faint wisp of black dust wherever she walked. Taliana turned and waved at the older woman, having just downed yet another mug of ale. I think we're thinking the same thing, Cole. How about we make it a competition? The Earth Genasi smiled warmly in reply and spun around to gather the other members of their party. The small performance troupe got to work, shoving together tables and stools, forming a makeshift stage under the watchful eye of the bartender. Meanwhile, Uli went table to table, chatting up their fellow customers about the upcoming show, building anticipation. Grimscab sighed, the only member of the party not helping in any way, picking at the stew in front of her, seated at a table by herself. Their caravan had just put on a play in town earlier that day. Surely they could spend just one night relaxing. Eventually, Urban came by, tapping his hooves impatiently as he glared at the seated half-orc, until she reluctantly got out of her chair. The patrons gathered to watch the group of 7, who drew straws. Ishmael ended up with the shortest one, and would be going last. He didn't mind. He loved to watch his friends perform almost as much as he loved performing himself. Howard went first, a talented orator, regaling the crowd with a dramatic poem about 2 siblings on opposing sides of a war. By the end of it, there weren't many dry eyes in the room. A pause, followed by sniffling, then earnest applause. Ishmael could swear he could hear the pulse of the sea nearby. Or maybe something was pulsing in his head. Great way to warm up the crowd, Howie. Get them all teary-eyed, Taliana muttered, clapping Howard on the back as he sat back down. Watch and learn. This is how you open a show. She took the stage next, small cymbals tinkling against each finger as she performed an intricate dance. It was sensual, and many eyes in the crowd could not take their attention off of her. Howard groaned. This is basically cheating, right, Ishmael? He nudged the other man playfully. Ishmael smiled, nodding, face flushed slightly from his drink and from how close Howard was seated to him. His sense of hearing was intensified. He could hear tiny things scuttling in the wooden walls around him. He could not stop staring at the symbols adorning Taliana's fingers. They were beginning to rust, and every time she clinked them together it sent microscopic flakes swirling into the air around her. As she finished with a bow, cheers and whooping were interspersed amongst the crowd's applause. She sat back down and motioned for Uli to take the stage. Once there, the gnome dramatically flipped their mop of multicolored hair, curtsied to the audience, and made a great show of preparing their violin.
Wait, Ishmael, darling, did we ever say what prize the winner gets?
Cole asked, crossing her arms. The greatest prize of all, my friend! The prize of knowing one has brought joy to others! Ishmael exclaimed. A couple of his companions rolled their eyes in response. He only took note of Howard's reaction, watched the man reward him with a smile for his earnestness, the fine lines around his eyes and mouth crinkling. He caught Urban's eyes as he turned his attention back to the violin performance that was now underway, who winked at him knowingly. The tiefling chuckled as Ishmael pretended that he didn't see him. One by one, his friends showed off on stage, the crowd growing more and more enthusiastic as the bartender went table to table, refilling drinks. It was now Grimscab's turn, second to last, before Ishmael himself. Sighing, she shook Ishmael's shoulder from behind, rougher than she meant to. Startled, he turned to look at her.
Hey, Izzy, I'm really not feeling it tonight. Would you hate me forever if I skip my turn?
Ishmael stared. He could hear her heart beating rapidly. No doubt it was throbbing in her ears. He could smell stress and exhaustion radiating from her, bitter and medicinal. He noted that her pupils were constricted. He could hear tears rushing through tubes towards the corners of her eyes as she tried to blink them away. Overwhelmed, Ishmael replied, "Oh, yeah, that's fine, Grim. You take care of yourself." He stood, smiled at her in what he hoped passed for a reassuring manner, before grabbing his hurdy-gurdy and made his way to the stage, bringing a stool with him to sit on as well. He heard Cole shush Urban before he could make any snide comments, as Grimscab sat back in her seat with a sigh of relief. He began his piece, strumming and cranking his instrument as he sang along to his newest song, a raunchy tune about a beautiful queen who could not decide who to marry out of her many, many suitors. His singing was passionate, and it always brought him great joy to share it.
I see how this is going,
Howard said, noting the crowd's reaction at some of the more risque bits.
Cheaters, the lot of you.
Sex sells, Howie, sex sells. Taliana laughed, ruffling the man's wavy hair as he tried to push her away. As he played, Ishmael's hurdy-gurdy began to sound off-key to his ears. Or was he just hearing it better than before? Or was his hearing getting worse? The voices of his friends were beginning to blur together. He contemplated this as he performed, his mind growing hazy as he felt his concentration slip away from him, his fingers dancing along his hurdy-gurdy without him. The room's voices were getting confused, as if they'd become mixed up. A thrum was rising under his skin, thrumming and humming, and something was ringing in his ears. It felt like something was coming toward him from very far away. Towards and into him. His throat was dry and his mouth tasted funny. He was still singing and playing his instrument, one hand strumming while the other worked the crank, although he could tell that he was now doing so quite badly, like a child who was playing for the very first time. His fingers were strumming too hard against the strings, and there was a wet quality to the notes emitting from them. He noted that his arms were streaked with blood as he now began to roar out a song he had never heard before, with lyrics that were incomprehensible. He watched his friends let their drinks fall from slack hands and stared at each other as if shocked by something. What were they so shocked by? Taliana was weeping, and Howard was shouting, "What are you doing, Ishmael? What the hell are you doing?" But Howard's voice was coming out of Taliana's throat, and liquid was pouring from Cole's ears, and some of the people around them had begun to slump in their seats. Had they been slumped over that way a moment before? Were they drunk or dead? Uli was struggling with the front door, couldn't get it to open, began to pound on a window with their fists. The sound oddly muffled, overwhelmed by the refrain pulsing in the air. He erupted out of his seat to stand, still playing. He was reaching a chaotic crescendo on his shouting, shrieking, yowling song, his fingers flaying themselves against strings, blood gushing down his arm down onto the floor. Something was hovering above him. Something was emanating out of him, was broadcasting through him on frequencies too high to hear, so low it made his teeth ache. Everyone was screaming, but their screams weren't coming from their mouths anymore, instead echoing all around the room, bouncing off of the tavern's walls, amplifying each other. What is happening? Izzy, stop! Hurry! Break the glass! I can't! I'm sorry! I'm so sorry! Grimscab was crawling away from the stage, pushing aside chairs as she went, pulling herself across the floor because her legs didn't work anymore. Someone was bashing their head against a window near the front door, but they were so red and wet, and there was so little of their head left that Ishmael couldn't tell if he knew who it was. Howard spun and twitched and twisted on the floor in front of him. He had made his way towards Ishmael, had been shouting at him until something stopped him. Now slamming himself into chairs and table legs, falling apart into small pieces. After a while, as if a switch had flipped in his mind, Ishmael knew that the song was over, and he didn't have to perform anymore. He stopped playing and staggered off the stage, realized that he was crying. He had stopped playing, but he could still hear the song repeating itself from the beginning as if on a loop, reverberating through his ears and mind. He refused to look closely at the scene around him, his mind foggy and confused. Everything was so red, and it smelled so bad. He ran towards the entrance of the tavern. He could not stay there. Whether it was all real or something he was hallucinating, he had to leave. He stumbled over the disfigured bodies of his friends and of strangers. He couldn't really tell who was who, and he didn't want to know. His boot caught on someone's open chest on the way to the front door. Felt something wet pop under it before he could yank it free. It took him a few tries to grasp the handle. His hands were so slippery and raw, and so was his throat. Coraline, help him. It hurt so bad. And suddenly someone was grabbing at his leg from the floor. He didn't want to know who. Kicked them away. Immediately regretting having done so, he tried to apologize, but all that came out was a rasp. And then the door burst open and he ran out, sobbing, running as long as he could. He had to get away. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. Some kind of horrible nightmare. Eventually, many hours later, collapsing on the side of a road, the sun beginning to peek over the horizon, his feet as raw and bloody as his hands were from running for as far as he did. As Ishmael lay on the side of the road, exhausted, panting, racked with pain, he tried to get his thoughts in order, tried to make sense of what had just happened. But he found that he couldn't concentrate on anything besides the horrible refrain that still emanated from inside him, eating away at his sanity. It would be hours before he finally found solace in the bittersweet embrace of slumber, as the song lulled him to sleep, and a voiceless voice from far beyond whispered,